Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you today in a way that feels honest, a way that feels like standing in the mirror and finally refusing to lie to yourself. Because how to force yourself to organize your life sounds like a productivity topic on the surface. But underneath it, it's really about discipline, identity, and the moment you decide that chaos is no longer your normal. And if we're being real, most of us don't struggle with knowing what to do. We struggle with becoming the kind of person who actually does it when no one is watching. I'm reminded of the powerful, soul-stirring way Sarah Jakes Roberts speaks. How she doesn't just preach inspiration, she confronts transformation because she understands that change isn't gentle all the time. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels like forcing yourself into alignment with the future you keep praying for. So today, I'm not here to motivate the version of you that wants change. I'm here to challenge the version of you that keeps delaying it. Because organizing your life isn't about having color-coded perfection or aesthetic routines. It's about deciding that your future deserves better than your excuses. And the truth is, discipline is not a feeling. It's a decision you make when your feelings say tomorrow, but your destiny says now. Discipline is chosen, not felt, and that truth alone is where most people wrestle with themselves every single day. Because we've been taught to wait for the perfect emotional condition before we act. We wait until we feel ready, until we feel inspired, until we feel strong enough, until we feel like the version of ourselves that already has everything together. But life does not respond to feelings the way it responds to consistency. Feelings are temporary visitors. They come and go like weather. But discipline is the structure you build your life on when the weather is unpredictable. There are moments when you will wake up and feel like you can conquer everything. And there are moments when you will wake up and feel like you cannot even conquer yourself. And if you only operate based on the days you feel strong, then you will always remain at the mercy of inconsistency. Discipline is not about waiting for alignment between your emotions and your responsibilities. It is about creating alignment through action, even when nothing inside you agrees with the direction you are moving in. Most people don't fail because they lack vision. They fail because they surrender to emotional authority. They let how they feel dictate what they do, and slowly their life becomes a reflection of every unchallenged emotion. You said you wanted to organize your life, but organization demands structure when your mind prefers comfort. It demands repetition when your spirit wants variety. It demands action when your body is negotiating rest. And in those moments, discipline is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is not emotional. It is a quiet decision that says, I will do it anyway. There is a version of you that already knows what needs to be done. That version has seen the clutter, the delayed tasks, the unmade decisions, the emotional weight of unfinished responsibilities. And still, that version waits. Not because of ignorance, but because of resistance. Resistance always feels justified in the moment. It says you're tired. It says you'll do it later. It says it's not that serious today. But what it is really doing is negotiating your future away in small increments. Discipline begins to form when you stop negotiating. When you stop having internal debates about whether you should act and simply decide that action is the default. It is in the small things that this battle is revealed. Making the bed when no one is coming to see it. Writing the plan when no one is asking for it. Cleaning the space even when you think you will mess it up again. Tomorrow. These are not just tasks. They are declarations of identity. Each action is a vote for the person you are becoming. And the hardest part is not starting once. It is continuing when nothing feels rewarding yet. Because early discipline feels invisible. There is no applause for choosing structure over chaos in private moments. There is no instant transformation that tells you it is working. You are simply stacking decisions on top of decisions, building something you cannot fully see yet but are expected to trust anyway. This is where many people break because they confuse lack of immediate reward with lack of progress. But discipline does not announce itself in the beginning. It reveals itself over time through repetition, through quiet consistency, through the moments you do not post, do not celebrate, do not even emotionally register as significant, and still you show up. There is also a deeper layer to this struggle because sometimes chaos becomes comfortable. It becomes familiar. It becomes a kind of identity where disorganization feels like personality rather than problem. And stepping out of that requires more than motivation. It requires confrontation with the version of you that has been surviving inside disorder. That version will resist change because change feels like loss, even when it is actually gain. So discipline is not just an external behavior. It is an internal confrontation. It is you looking at yourself and deciding that your feelings are not the final authority anymore. It is choosing structure over spontaneity in moments where spontaneity has cost you too much. It is deciding that your future self deserves systems that your current self will not always feel like maintaining. And still you maintain them because you are no longer building your life around comfort. You are building it around direction. And direction requires walking even when the path feels unfinished. Chaos is a habit, not a destiny. And that truth can feel uncomfortable because it removes the excuse that many people quietly lean on when life feels out of control. It suggests that what you are living inside of right now is not something that simply happened to you without your participation, but something that has been reinforced through repeated choices, patterns, reactions, and tolerances over time. And when something becomes habitual, it starts to feel like identity, even when it is not. Chaos does not usually arrive all at once. It builds slowly through small permissions you give yourself. When you decide that structure can wait, that order is optional, that consistency is something for another version of you who has more time, more energy, more clarity. One skipped routine becomes two. Two becomes a pattern, and before long, disorder begins to feel normal. And once normal is established, anything outside of it feels foreign, even threatening. There is a psychological comfort in chaos that many people do not acknowledge. It creates an illusion of freedom, a sense that nothing is binding you, nothing is restricting you, nothing is demanding too much of you. But over time, that same freedom becomes fragmentation. Your thoughts are scattered, your responsibilities overlap without resolution. Your environment begins to reflect your internal state. And suddenly what felt like freedom starts to feel like weight you cannot name but constantly carry. The important thing to understand is that habits are built through repetition, not intention. You do not become chaotic because you plan to be. You become chaotic because you repeated small behaviors that reinforce disorder as your default response. Ignoring tasks once does not create chaos, but ignoring them repeatedly teaches your mind that delay is acceptable. Avoiding organization one day does not define your life, but avoiding it consistently trains your environment to remain unstructured around you. And once chaos becomes familiar, it begins to defend itself. It convinces you that you work better under pressure, even when pressure is the only environment you know anymore. It tells you that you are just not organized by nature, as if order is a trait you are born with rather than a skill you develop. It reframes lack of structure as personality so that you stop questioning it and start accepting it. But destiny is not written in disorder. Destiny is not confused. Destiny is not confused. Destiny does not scatter itself across unfinished tasks and unmade decisions. What often feels like destiny is actually accumulated habit. And the moment you begin to separate your identity from your patterns, you start to realize that you are not bound to the environment you have been living in, even if you have lived in it for a long time. Breaking chaos is not about a dramatic overhaul. It is about interruption. It is about stepping into your daily patterns and refusing to continue what you have normalized. It is choosing to respond differently to the same triggers that once led you into avoidance. It is deciding that the clutter you used to walk past now requires action, that the unfinished responsibilities you used to delay now require attention, that the scattered rhythm of your life is no longer something you will participate in without question. But interruption feels foreign at first, because every habit creates a sense of belonging, even unhealthy ones. So when you begin to introduce order, your mind may resist it. It may try to pull you back into familiar disorganization because familiarity feels safer than change. This is where many people mistake resistance for incompatibility, thinking maybe I'm just not built for structure, when in reality they are just uncomfortable with the early stages of rewiring behavior. Chaos also feeds on emotional impulsivity, reacting first and thinking later, responding based on mood rather than intention, allowing temporary feelings to dictate long-term outcomes. And over time, that pattern creates a life that feels unpredictable, not because life itself is unstable, but because your responses to life are inconsistent. The environment begins to mirror the instability of your decisions. The shift begins when you stop treating chaos as your baseline and start treating it as something you are actively dismantling. When you begin to question your automatic responses instead of obeying them. When you pause long enough to notice that every delayed action is contributing to a larger system of disorder that you then feel overwhelmed by later. And in that awareness, something begins to loosen. A recognition that you are not trapped in destiny, but entangled in repetition, that you are capable of interrupting, even if it feels unfamiliar, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it requires you to become someone who no longer recognizes comfort in the same patterns that once defined you. Your future requires structure, not intentions. Because intentions alone are fragile things that live comfortably in the mind, but struggle to survive in the real world where consistency is demanded every single day. Intention is where people begin. It is where they feel inspired. It is where they make promises to themselves in moments of clarity. But structure is what carries those promises beyond emotion into execution. And the truth is, many people are living surrounded by good intentions that were never supported by systems strong enough to hold them accountable when motivation faded. A future is not built in a single moment of inspiration. It is built in the architecture of repetition. Structure is what gives your life a framework so that even when your emotions fluctuate, your direction remains stable. Without structure, your future becomes dependent on how you feel in the present. And feelings are not reliable architects. They shift too easily. They bend under pressure. They change with circumstances. And if your life is built on them, then your future will always be unstable, no matter how powerful your dreams are. There is a difference between wanting something and organizing your life to receive it. Wanting is emotional. It is spontaneous. It is often sincere, but it is not enough to carry transformation. Structure is the decision to take that wanting and translate it into repeatable action. It is what turns desire into discipline and discipline into evidence. Because your future does not respond to what you say you want. It responds to what you consistently build space for in your daily life. Many people underestimate how much structure removes emotional fatigue. When there is no system in place, every decision becomes a negotiation. You wake up and ask yourself what you should do, when you should do it, how you should do it, and whether you feel like doing it. That constant internal debate drains energy before any actual work begins. But structure eliminates unnecessary decisions. It creates a rhythm that your life can follow even when your mind is not fully engaged, even when your motivation is low, even when your clarity is not at its highest point. Your future is not just delayed by lack of effort. It is often delayed by lack of order. Because effort without structure becomes scattered effort, and scattered effort rarely produces lasting results. You can be busy and still be building nothing stable. You can be active and still be moving in circles. Structure is what gives your effort direction. It turns movement into progress. It too reins repetition into growth. It turns routine into development, and yet structure is often resisted because it feels restrictive at first. It demands consistency when you are used to flexibility. It demands repetition when you are used to spontaneity. It demands commitment when you are used to option. But what feels like restriction in the beginning is actually protection in disguise. Structure protects your future self from the chaos of your current impulses. It creates boundaries that safeguard your progress from being constantly reset by inconsistency. There is also a deeper truth that many people avoid confronting, and it is that intentions without structure can sometimes become a form of self-deception. You can feel productive simply by thinking about what you will do later. You can feel hopeful just by imagining a better version of your life. But without structure, those thoughts never leave the mental space. They never enter the physical world in a way that changes anything tangible. And over time, that gap between intention and execution becomes frustration, because you begin to realize you have been mentally living a life that your reality is not reflecting. Structure requires honesty. It requires you to look at your actual patterns, not your desired ones. It requires you to see where time is being lost, where energy is being wasted, where repetition is inconsistent. And that kind of honesty can feel uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that you are closer to your goals than your habits actually show. But that discomfort is also where transformation begins, because once you see clearly, you can begin to build differently. The future you are hoping for is not waiting on more inspiration. It is waiting on more structure. It is waiting on systems that support the life you say you want, systems that remain in place even when you are tired, even when you are tired, even when you are distracted, even when you do not feel emotionally aligned with effort. Because alignment is not always emotional. Sometimes alignment is mechanical. It is showing up at the same time, doing the same foundational actions, repeating the same commitments until they begin to shape identity rather than just reflect a desire. And in that space where structure begins to take root, you start to realize that your future was never far away. It was simply unsupported by the consistency required to bring it into reality. And now as you begin to build frameworks that hold your intentions in place long enough for them to become lived experience, rather than just imagined possibility that keeps unfolding into something more stable, but still forming motivation, fades. Systems sustain. And this is one of the most uncomfortable truths people have to accept, because motivation feels like fire in the beginning, bright, loud, convincing enough to make you believe that you have finally changed, but fire by nature is temporary. It burns intensely, and then it begins to fade when fuel is not consistently added, and most people mistake that initial spark for sustainable. Transformation, they assume that because they feel motivated, they will automatically stay consistent. But feeling is not a system. Feeling is a signal, not a structure. And when you build your life on signals instead of structures, you will always be. Restarting yourself every time your emotional state changes motivation will get you started, but it will never be responsible for keeping you going. Systems are what carry you beyond the emotional peak, because systems do not depend on how you feel, and systems do not depend on how you feel. The moment they depend on what you have decided in advance, they are pre-made decisions that remove the burden of constant negotiation. When you wake up with a system in place, you are not asking yourself if you should do something. You are simp. Leave following what you already committed to, and that removes a huge amount of internal conflict that most people mistake for laziness or lack of discipline, but it is actually exhaustion from decision overload when everything is negotiable. Nothing is stable, and your mind becomes the battleground of every small choice. And that is where people lose momentum. Motivation will always be inconsistent because it is tied to emotion, and emotion is influenced by sleep, by stress, by environment, by conversations, by disappointment, by expectations, and even by the weather of your inner world. Systems are not emotional. They are architectural. They are built to function. Even when you are not functioning at your best, they are what hold your life together when your feelings are inconsistent. And this is why people who rely only on motivation often feel like they are constantly starting over. They wait for the right mood, the right energy, the right moment, and those conditions rarely align. Consistently, systems remove the need for perfect conditions they create. Consistency inside imperfection, and that is what actually produces results. Over time, not intensity, but repetition, not excitement, but structure. And when motivation disappears, systems remain quietly doing the work in the background, even when you do not feel connected to the outcome, even when progress feels slow, even when your emotions are pulling you in every direction. Systems are what carry you through inconsistency, through doubt, through distraction, through emotional collapse, and through the moments where you feel like giving up, because they are not dependent on your current state. They are dependent on the structure you built before the feeling arrived or disappeared. And that is where the difference between people who only dream and people who actually build begins to show itself in real time, in real habits, in real life. Because motivation will introduce you to the idea of change, but systems will carry you into the reality of change. And without systems, you remain an introduction. Without execution and imagination, without embodiment, systems are the bridge between what you say you want and what your life actually reflects. And every time you follow a system, instead of a mood, you reinforce identity. Rather than impulse, you teach yourself that consistency is possible even when your emotions are not cooperating, and slowly repetition begins to replace resistance, and structure begins to replace chaos. And what once required effort begins to feel like identity. But even when it does not feel easy, it still holds you steady in moments where motivation would have already left you drifting back into inconsistency, into delay, into negotiation with yourself. Systems are what remain when excitement fades, when clarity blurs, when energy drops, when life becomes heavy and uncertain. And it is in those moments that they matter most, because they continue to operate even when you are not operating. And that continuity is what builds momentum that does not rely on feeling, but on delay, is disguised self-sabotage. And one of the most deceptive things about it is that it rarely introduces itself as destruction. It arrives wearing reasonable language. It sounds responsible. It feels patient. It even convinces you that you are being wise by waiting for a better time. But in reality, delay is often just fear that has learned how to speak politely to your conscience, so you don't resist it immediately when you delay something important. You rarely experience it as harm in the moment. It feels like relief. It feels like space. It feels like you are giving yourself permission to breathe. But what you are actually doing is transferring pressure from the present moment into the future. And every time you postpone what you know needs to be done, you are removing the burden, you are compounding it silently underneath the surface, where it begins to grow heavier than it needed to be. Self-sabotage is not always dramatic. It is not always loud. It is not always loud. It is not always self-destructive in obvious ways. Sometimes it looks like waiting. Sometimes it looks like overthinking. Sometimes it looks like preparation without execution, without execution, without execution. Sometimes it looks like convincing yourself that you work better under pressure, when in reality, pressure is just the only environment where urgency finally overrides, avoidance, delay thrives, and emotional negotiation. It begins when you start discussing with yourself instead of directing yourself, when you turn instructions into debates, when you make simple actions into complex decisions that require emotional readiness before execution. But readiness is often a myth, because most meaningful actions are not preceded by perfect emotional alignment. They are preceded by decision. And that is where self-sabotage hides most effectively, in the gap between knowing and doing. Because awareness alone creates the illusion of progress you feel like, because you understand what needs to change, you are already changing. But understanding without execution is just internal observation. It does not alter outcomes. It only increases frustration over time. The mind will always produce reasons for delay. It is skilled at protecting comfort, even when comfort is costing growth. It will say later. It will say tomorrow. It will say after this situation settles, after this stress reduces, after this mood improves. But life rarely gives perfect conditions in the way the mind negotiates for them. So delay becomes a cycle where action is always conditional and conditions are never fully met. And slowly delay begins to shape identity. Without you realizing it, you stop seeing yourself as someone who acts and start seeing yourself as someone who intends, someone who thinks deeply but struggles to execute, and that identity becomes reinforcing because every time you delay again, you confirm the narrative you are unconsciously building about yourself. What makes delay so dangerous is that it feels harmless in isolation. One postponed task does not feel like self-sabotage. One avoided responsibility does not feel like a turning point, but identity is not built in isolated moments. It is built in repetition. And when delay becomes repetitive, it stops being an action and starts becoming a pattern that quietly defines the structure of your life. There is also an emotional component to delay that people rarely confront directly, which is the discomfort of facing what needs to be done, because action often requires confrontation with imperfection, with uncertainty, with the possibility that you may not perform as well as you want to. So the mind chooses postponement as a form of emotional protection. But what it protects you from in the moment, it traps you in over time. And over time, delay creates accumulation, emotional accumulation, mental clutter, unfinished responsibility, stacking on unfinished responsibility until even thinking about starting feels overwhelming, not because the task itself is impossible, but because the weight of everything delayed has created an internal resistance that grows stronger the longer it is ignored. Self-sabotage does not always look like stopping completely. Sometimes it looks like staying in motion without direction, staying busy without completion, staying engaged without progress, because delay can also disguise itself as partial effort, where you do just enough to feel involved, but not enough to create change. And that middle space becomes comfortable enough to stay in, but not powerful enough to transform anything. And the most difficult truth about delay is that it always borrows from your future self. Every time you postpone action, you are asking a later version of you to carry more weight, make harder decisions, repair more damage, make harder decisions, repair more damage, and operate under more pressure than necessary. And eventually that future version becomes overwhelmed, not because of one decision, but because of 1,000 small permissions given to delay that were never interrupted before they became habit. And now the distance between intention and action feels wider than it actually is, because the habit of postponing has become so familiar that it feels like part of your rhythm of living rather than something that can be interrupted in real time if you decide to. Order in life begins with inner decision. And this is where most people look in the wrong direction because they try to fix their environment before they have settled the internal agreement that change is necessary and non-negotiable. But nothing external can remain ordered if the internal world is still negotiating with chaos every time a decision needs to be made. The outside world is always a reflection of the inside world over time, not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually through repeated choices that either reinforce clarity or reinforce confusion. Inner decision is not about motivation. It is about finality. It is the moment where you stop asking yourself whether you should change and you start declaring that you already have. That shift may sound subtle, but it changes everything that follows, because as long as change is still a question, your behavior will remain inconsistent.